Thank you so much, Taylor. And welcome everybody today to today's session on generational. G is for generational. And I want to read some things that I've come across just in the last couple of weeks. Knowing that this program was coming up, I pulled them out and I thought, oh my gosh, I have to read that when we're talking about G is for generational in the libraries. There is an author who is considered one of the foremost authorities on dealing with different generations. His name is Haydn Shaw, and I was reading an article where somebody had sort of encapsulated what Haydn Shaw's most popular book was, which was Sticking Points, and it means the sticking points between generations. So I wanted to read a few things before we get started today so that you think in terms of the differences of the generations. Now, before we do that, if you have not printed your handouts or have them on a screen up in front of you, please do that now. We are actually going to be using our handouts a little bit more than we are our slides today. I didn't want to just duplicate a lot of the wording that was on our handouts, and I tried to do a lot of wording on there so that you didn't have to do as much writing today. So the handouts will be very important for you, or of course, you can always feel free to take notes, but the handouts have some key information that will not be on the slides. We'll talk about some of it, but I won't be reading it word for word. So if you've got your handouts available, great. If you don't, take a moment now to either download them and have them up on the screen or print them off so that you can have them in front of you. I know that we kill squirrel houses when we print a lot. However, I will tell you that this might be a good resource for you later. So printing it might be a good thing, because it's just some very key foundational information to the generations. And what we're going to do today is a little bit different than what I've done in my sessions of DDI. We are going to dig a little deeper into why there is a difference in the generations. I find this fascinating, and it really opened up my eyes a few years ago when I started doing generational studies, that even though that particular element of researching it and studying it doesn't really make dealing with other generations necessarily easy because we are different, but it does make it easier. And I can attest to that because since I have started doing these studies, it has made it easier for me. Sometimes it's still not easy. We are just different when we're of a different generation. So with that being said, I want to read a few of the highlights this particular person quoted from Haydn Shaw. One was, in previous eras, there were only 3 generations. The oldest generation had the money, made the decisions, and the younger generation of adults raised the children and did what the older generation asked them to do until the parents died. And then their turn came in. It came around to be in control. Changes in families came slowly and naturally with little disruption. And I think that's one of the key points we can remember about the differences in generations now, because it was so slow, probably because of that little thing we call the internet. We didn't have that. We didn't have computers. We didn't have news at our fingertips in a split second. And so hearing about other things that were happening maybe in other parts of the country or whatever was very slow, and it was very slow for us to make changes in those ways. And then the next point is, but today for the first time in history, we have, and this was written a year and a half ago, we have 5 generations in our families and communities, and I added a note to myself, and in our libraries. And technically, if everybody started out having children very young, we could almost have 6 generations because people are living so much longer. The next thing he says is, we've been telling young people for 20 years that their generation could be the difference makers, that their lives could be big and they are dreaming too small. And I love this point. It's time to tell their grandparents the same thing. And we are seeing a little bit of that happening, aren't we? You're probably seeing that in your libraries. I see it in my community. I happen to live in a retirement community. And my retirement community offers, they just put out their new catalog for the new semester, and they offer 600 classes this semester on everything from Socrates to using quinoa in recipes, stained glass, and all kinds of things to improve your mind and improve your life and improve your health and all those kinds of things. So I think that this quote that he says it's time to tell their grandparents the same thing is also starting to filter through. And you've probably noticed in your libraries that quote, the older generation may be frequenting your library more to learn things that they didn't really pay much attention to in the past. Another quote that he has on here is, Generation X is the most misunderstood and invisible of the generations. I have a book that a Generation X librarian referred me to called How Generation X Saved the World, and it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but it notes the name itself illustrates the problem. Gen Xers don't like the label, so they just wanted to be called Gen X. Don't label us. Don't put us in a box. So that's where the Gen Xers are. And then for the millennials, he comments, millennials are confident. Their parents and teachers convince them they're special, and the millennials believe it. In one survey, 96% of millennials agreed or somewhat agreed with the statement, I can do something great, and not one disagreed strongly. So that just starts to give you a background on the differences in the generations. Another quote that I found, this person was quoting Jim Collins in a book called Built to Last, another thought leader of our day. He wrote about the genius of the and when we were talking about generations. His premise was that often the choice isn't between two contradictory alternatives, but two options where both ideas can be included simultaneously with a little creativity and effort. And doesn't that apply as well to programming and services that we offer in our libraries to our community? Instead of thinking they all have to be for the baby boomers, or this one has to be for the millennials, or this one has to be for the Gen Xers, maybe if we add the and in there, there's a way we can be creative and make it about both of the generations, and that's when we start to bridge the gap. So I loved those two things. And I have a couple of other things that I'll mention to you as we go along. But first I want to talk to you, if you see the slide there, it's about 6 years old now. I couldn't find anything with just the population as far as a nice graph. To be honest with you, I wanted to put something pretty and colorful on this slide, and all I could find was the actual statistics, but I thought this gave us a real good picture because we all know that the traditionalists are fading away. They're the oldest group among us. The baby boomers are still a big percentage, and I think most recently maybe the Gen Y people or the millennials have overtaken that, but it's kind of a neck and neck race there. The baby boomers, of course, are also starting to fade away, and when I say that I mean pass away. The Gen Xers only 21%, so you can see why they feel a little left out, and then as I mentioned, the Gen Y, 34% at the time of this graph. But it starts to give us a really clear picture of why there are some differences in attitudes. Now, this particular slide has absolutely nothing to do with generations. It has to do with you. And I want you to kind of settle your mind today. And this is called a Johari window. And Johari only means that Joe and Harry developed it. Seriously. When I first heard that term years ago, I thought, ooh, that sounds really fancy. And then as I read about what it was a great tool, but I found out that Joe and Harry actually did develop it, which I thought was kind of amusing. But it is a great tool. It talks about the 4 parts of your mind. The first one is what I know about me and what you know about me. So we both know that Linda Bruno is a female, she does training. It's very obvious that I do training. I'm here today. Then there's the blind area. What you might know about me that I don't. Maybe I have certain mannerisms. Maybe if you've seen me in person, maybe I have certain gestures that I do without even realizing it. So it's something that they know about you, but you don't realize. So that's something to think about today, isn't it? Is there a blind area as we're going to start talking about generations? I think we all have a bit of a blind area. Could be on any one of the generations, could be on our own generation, whatever, but I think we have a bit of a blind area. Then there's the hidden area. This is the one that you know how you feel about this generation or that generation, or the generalities that you make, or the thoughts that come to mind. Diana and I were chatting beforehand about snowbirds. Well, snowbirds aren't millennials, are they, typically? Snowbirds are probably baby boomers. And as we were talking, I realized that we were kind of being stereotypical, if you will. But when push comes to shove, stereotypes are developed because they tend to be true for a large percentage of that population. That can change over time, certainly, but that's the reason. And we talked about snowbirds and the traffic, and I was saying that they tend to go to Publix the day the ad comes out and all those kinds of things. So although I don't want to share my hidden areas with you, you will find, some of you that know me, that I try to be very transparent when I'm doing these kinds of programs, because I also learn from them, and I'm not perfect. Even though I've done programs time and time and time again, and I continue to research and I continue to grow, I hope, and develop, there are still things that I don't like about myself in different categories that I teach on. And one of them is the generations, because I know, especially if I'm tired or sad or depressed or whatever it might be, and my nerves are a little on edge, I'm a lot quicker to judge those generations, and maybe you are too. So I want you to think about all of these things as we're going through today's session. The unknown area, I joke that maybe this should be a triangle instead of a square, because if they don't know and you don't know, then how do we know it's there? But this could be things like abuse in your past that you don't recognize or you don't realize. It could be things like how you were raised the first 2 years of your life, things that happen to you that you really don't even realize. So that's considered the unknown area. We're not going to worry about that today, but I do want you to think about particularly your blind area. I hope to open your eyes a little bit today, and also your hidden area. I hope that you'll be willing to admit to at least yourself that there may be judgments that you're making that aren't fair, and even if they seem fair to you, that really don't serve a purpose. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? That, that person may be acting in a way that's very stereotypical, but does it make a difference if you get aggravated by that? Probably not, because what we're going to learn today is some of the reasons they might be acting that way. So that's what I want you to think about. Now, the last thing I'm going to actually read to you from the outside sources that I was thinking about is on empathy. And this is called Psychological Perspectives and Empathy, because I think we need to have empathy as we're talking about generations. One thing I read was we must understand before we judge. And that, when I read that, that's sort of how I developed this program, is to think about an understanding. If you think about Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that was so popular maybe 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, and is still a very good seller because a lot of it has really relevant material for today. But one of his habits was seek first to understand and then be understood. And that involves empathy, doesn't it? The definition here of empathy is the experience of understanding another person's condition from their perspective. You place yourself in their shoes and feel what they're feeling. It doesn't necessarily mean that you agree that they should act the way they're acting. It just means that now you have a little bit of understanding about why they're acting that way. And remember what I said in that one of the first quotes I gave you was, it doesn't necessarily make it easy to deal with them, but maybe it will make it easier, and that's my goal for today. So hopefully by now you have your handouts printed or up on the screen beside you, because in the middle of page 1 of your handouts it says Notes to Self. The question I want to ask you, and I want you to write there or write on your own notes as you're taking them, or at least think about, is what might be my blind spot when it comes to generations? What might be my generational bias, if you will? For me, when I was writing that out, the examples that came to mind is, one example that came to mind is, we kind of think of people as they age as becoming less competent, and that they're a bit grumpy, and that they're not very contented. And some of that may very well be true, and certainly society has made that so prevalent, if you will, or made us so aware of that, that then some people as they age become very fearful of not being competent, even though they're perfectly competent. I'm going to give you an example. Excuse me. Some of you know that my husband passed away a couple of months ago. And horrible time, horrible situation, the whole bit. He'd been very ill for a while. But what happened after that was the same thing that happens to a lot of people who lose a spouse or a significant other, and that is that for some reason Linda Bruno suddenly felt less competent. Here's an example of that. I need to have some drapes hung. I hate those kinds of things. I need to spray the eaves this weekend with Wet and Forget, which is a mildew reducer. I'm afraid of heights, and my eaves are pretty high. The flapper on the toilet needs repaired. I don't like to mess with that kind of stuff. I can just picture the whole thing spraying and, filling the bathroom. You know what? Before he passed away, I was perfectly competent to do all of those things and did them because he was not able. And yet that shift in my life as I age, and that sometimes happens along with that, we lose that person, has caused me to feel less competent. Thank you, Ernestine. I appreciate that. It's very, very tough. But that's one example of what your blind spot might be, what your generational bias might be. On the other end of that, some of us who are not young anymore, and I am not young, I consider myself very young acting, I feel young, my mind is young, but the calendar says I'm not. But we might think all young people feel entitled. That's sort of what society has told us we're supposed to think. I mean, every article out there says this about millennials. That article that I just read to you, one of the points was millennials are confident, their parents and teachers convince them they are special, and the millennials believe it. Okay, so this fellow, Hayden Shaw, has done research into generations for over 20 years. So I think he's got a pretty good grip on that. And yet we know that's not true for every millennial. We know that not every young person feels entitled, and even the ones who do have a lot to offer and maybe have earned that. Who knows? So that's the bias that I want you to think about this morning as we get started. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. As I told you, you all know, I consider you all friends, and maybe that's too personal to share in a webinar, but I just want you to know where I'm coming from and that this is real life stuff for me when we talk about generations, because I am one, and you are too, so we need to recognize what's going on in our generations, don't we? Okay, middle of page 1 for our handouts. What are some of the common values and needs that all generations in our library share? And I apologize for the words running off. That's my favorite Adobe trick. Once we load the slides, Adobe goes, I think I'll stretch this out some and make it run off of the slide. So I apologize that. But I want you to think about that. Thank you, Christine. I appreciate that. Type into the chat box, what are some of the common values and needs that any generation that comes into your library would share with every other generation? What are some things that they are hoping for? Just type it into the chat box. Yeah, a lot of them share a love of reading, or certainly maybe, Emily, a love of knowledge or learning. Even if they don't read, they might have audiobooks or music or things like that, work on the computer. So certainly that love of reading ties right in with love of learning. Learning about each other. Yeah, a lot of them come for social aspects, don't they, Jan? And I think the more we can encourage that these days among generations, the better off we're all going to be. And as Lisa said, wanting to learn something new. Even if we stretch that a little bit and say wanting to expose themselves to something different. Willing to learn is another word for that. Wanting to learn and willing to learn. Because there are people in all generations that really aren't willing, are they? They think they already know it all. We all went through that phase when we were younger, and if you are young, you're probably going through that phase right now. So wanting to learn, willing to learn, learning about each other, loving to read, all those kinds of things. And even deeper than that, let me just give you one that I put in. Trust. They have that need when they walk into the library, don't they? Yes, Christine, a sense of belonging, shared community space. And they aren't going to do that if they don't trust the people in the library. Whether they are 17, we're going to talk primarily about people that are more in an adult range today, although the younger people certainly have a generation of their own and deserve our attention. We kind of pay a lot of attention to them already, and we really don't give a lot of thought to the differences because they're still growing and learning and changing and developing their own maturity, aren't they? As a matter of fact, I was reading about the age of adulthood the other day, and that has changed as far as an emotional kind of process from us maybe that are older thinking that it used to be 18, 20, 21 to now psychologists are saying 26, 27, 28. could be any of those ages. And I do have something to read for you when we start talking about millennials that will kind of give us a sense of why that is. So trust is one thing that's even the value. That's a value that people need, isn't it? They want to be valued and appreciated. Like Christine said, they want that sense of belonging. You don't feel like you belong if you don't feel valued and appreciated. And if for some reason we're leaving out a generation or we're not paying attention to a particular generation, they no longer feel valued. Somebody asked me once, when we talk about emotional intelligence, somebody said, why do you think it is on the graph that they show sometimes with emotional intelligence, that emotional intelligence peaks maybe in our 40s and 50s and starts to go down in our 60s and 70s? I have a philosophy about that part of it is that the people in their 60s and 70s start to feel less valued by society in general. If attention is paid, it's paid as a pat on the head kind of a thing. You feel very patronized, very condescended to, those kinds of things. So I'm going to throw that out to you as you're thinking about dealing with, quote, the older generation, that even as you're trying to offer really rich programs and things, make sure that they don't come off sounding as if, here, we're going to give you this to do to keep you busy because you're old, kind of a thing. I shared with somebody, one of the things that made me feel like that's what was happening was many years ago when I moved to Florida, and I was by far not in an older generation, I didn't think at that time. I walked into JCPenney, and they were playing loud, heavy metal music. And I thought I was hearing things. And it was so, and I'm an introvert, so it didn't have so much to do with my age as it did with my personality, if you will. And I don't mind soft, pleasant background music, but this was thumping and carrying on, and I left in about 5 minutes, and I didn't go back for a long time thinking, well, maybe that was just an aberration. Maybe I imagined it. It didn't really happen. So I went back again, and the same thing happened. Now, I don't think that's happening anymore, but it might have been during that time when JCPenney was trying to determine which generation they were going to market to. Do you see how that ties in with your library? And they decided to go after the younger generation. Very valid from a business standpoint, maybe from a library standpoint, because those people are out in the marketplace. But they chased me away. I didn't feel valued, and I didn't feel appreciated, and I didn't feel I could trust them anymore to pay attention to my needs. So do you see how that ties in with different generations? Everybody is looking for respect. Although we need to understand there's a possibility that different generations might define that differently. Fairness. They just want to be treated fairly. That's very common, isn't it? We want to feel like we're being treated fairly. They want to feel balance. They want to feel like they have work involved or something productive involved, or they're needed, along with enjoyment and pleasure. So all of us have that kind of basic need. A lot of the values and needs of the generations in our libraries, particularly our co-workers, but sometimes our volunteers as well, want to help patrons in the community. It's very common. Why would you work at a library? Now, I did have somebody tell me a few months ago in a face-to-face workshop, I come for the paycheck. And that's a very honest answer. But I really think if you detested helping patrons in the community, you probably wouldn't stay. So I think that's still a basic need, if you will, or a value, if you will, of your coworkers and your volunteers. And those people who are working with you, volunteering at the library, the board, the people that really get involved want that sense of accomplishment. And a lot of times your patrons want a sense of accomplishment too, don't they? So those are all things that we all need. Here's where we're going to start looking at the differences. Let's first look at the categories. Now, I will tell you that I have read a lot on this, and the dates change on almost everything I read. These are very general categories, if you will, and the dates may not be the dates you read last week, but I kind of group them from the ones I saw most, and these are where the categories fall. So before 1945 are called the traditionalists, and they're very traditional in their thinking, in their ways of doing things, in their ways of working, and so forth, and their expectations. Then from 46 to 64, we have the baby boomers. Realizing that anybody that's born at either end of these categories, they're called cuspers because they're on the cusp of both generations. And a lot of the influence will be how they were raised, maybe even some geographical influence, maybe whether they're city or suburban or rural. So if they're on a cusp, they could fall either way. That's not really that important, is it? And it's not really that important the exact dates that somebody decides, because as I said, different experts have decided on different dates. The importance comes in that there definitely is a generation from generation kind of a thing in our lives. 65 to 84, Gen X, those are those ones that didn't want to be categorized or labeled and who are the smallest group of the last few generations. The millennials are also called Gen Y, Gen Next. There are other names out there. And then the latest generation, some people are calling them Gen Z. I saw an article where MTV calls them the founders. And I guess that's the founders of this new world that we're kind of exposed to. I saw another one that said iGen, like iPad or iPod or whatever, iPhone. And of course, these people are the most technology dependent because they are grown into it. They are digital natives. They can't even imagine a world when there wasn't an iPhone that could take a picture and send text messages and all that. They can't even comprehend that. So it gives us kind of a look, and if you look at the difference between certainly the traditionalists to the Gen Z or the millennials, huge difference in what they've been exposed to. But also even the baby boomers and the millennials. So as we start to work through this, we're going to look at events and attitudes that affected how those generations move through life. This is the part that I talked about right at the beginning, where your understanding of them will make life easier, not easy necessarily. But on your handouts, I've left blank spaces for you to just note how your attitudes developed or how their attitudes developed from these events and how that might look in the diversity of your library. Because if we understand what they've lived through, we'll understand, I don't want to call it baggage that they bring in the front door, let's call it luggage. Because it's really not baggage, it's just who they are. It's just how they developed. It's just what they've learned and grown through and experienced in life. If we understand what's in their luggage, let's just stretch that analogy a little bit further. Thinking about luggage. If you got off the plane in New York City and there were people around you, and for some reason 3 or 4 people had their suitcases pop open, you would get a glimpse of why they were in New York City, wouldn't you? You would maybe sense whether they were there on business, whether they were there on pleasure, whether it looks like they're actually moving there. You kind of get a sense from what's in their luggage. I want you to kind of think about that when you're thinking about what they bring into the library, because their whole history and how they were born and what generation they were born into is part of their luggage. As I said, please don't think of it as baggage. It's who they are. It's not something they can change. Those events happened to them in their lifetime, and it will influence how they feel and how they interact with people in your library. So let's look at the traditionalists, and these would also be the cusp or boomers that were born very close to the beginning of the baby boom. The event was the Great Depression. The effect, and this is on your handouts, they're cautious, they're thrifty, they're used to sacrifice, hard work, waste not, want not. Economic conservatism spread to other areas. So I want you to think about that. What's your first thought when you think about a traditionalist who went through the Great Depression? How does that affect how they interact in your library? What do you think? Just type that into the chat box, if you will. And we're at the top of page 2, by the way. As I noted there, you may feel that they're kind of stuck. They only have one way of thinking. They really aren't open to other ways of thinking, but they are very loyal, stable, and structured. Yes, Emily, they are probably more socially conservative as well. Absolutely, I agree with that. I see other people typing, so I want to wait until I hear from everybody. Because I want this to be about you today. I want you to think through how you perceive these people and why you perceive them that way. And Lisa said they're not used to technology, how to use a computer often. Some of them are thrilled by that. Some of them are scared by that. They could feel overwhelmed by it, Christine said. Absolutely. I remember I had, when I was doing my MBA program, which as some of you know was just a few years ago, I graduated 4 whole years ago with my MBA, but I had a professor that was probably a few years older than I was, and he was so enamored of his phone, he made mention of it in almost every class, and instead of looking like he was on top of things, which I think is what his intent was, he actually looked like he was a dinosaur because he made such a big deal out of it. Because everybody had phones and they'd had them for years in that class. And so it ended up being almost a negative for him to call attention to it. The fact that he had one was good. The fact that he used it was great. But the fact that he called attention to how wonderful it was and how it had changed his life and how he didn't know how he had ever lived without it and so forth kind of made him seem old. Heather said, cautious of change, suspicious. Look at the words you've used. Overwhelmed, not used to, cautious, suspicious. Those are great words in describing this, aren't they? Absolutely. Conservative. All those words that you've put in there. They still want books. They want hardbacks, not ebooks. And Lisa, I'm not a traditionalist, thank you, but I am one of those people that loves a book. And I was reading something the other day by the former CEO of a publishing company that had gotten away from books after he started his own business. He's no longer in the publishing industry. He started his own business and he started to read ebooks and just thought that was wonderful. And he said, you know what I've found lately? I miss holding a book. And he's not a traditionalist. He's probably a baby boomer, but they still want books. Yeah, and Jan's one of those who loves a book too. I have an e-reader. I love it when I travel. I don't love it so much at home or in my office. I never read a business book on my e-reader. I can't highlight. I can't. Yes, I know you can, but it's not easy to get back to. I can't mark the pages as easy and so forth. So there are reasons some of these things happen. The other thing that I put down for the traditionalists is sometimes we judge them as being judgmental. We are judgmental about them being judgmental, because they expect the same thing from other people. Just like every generation doesn't get why a different generation doesn't look at things the way they do, we look at the traditionalist as being judgmental, when in reality they're often self-sacrificing and hardworking. And Rosa says they prefer a person in customer service, not a machine. Rosa, that's a great point. My mom, years ago, we lived in Ohio, and Kroger put in some of the first self-checkout machines that were ever seen. I went right to the self-checkout thinking, oh good, I can move through here a lot quicker. I don't have to mess with people. My mom said, they're just trying to get me to do their work. And she went through the line every time. So they preferred a person. Emily says, tablet for travel, book for reading at home is my preference. I'm right there with you, Emily. So that kind of gives us an idea of what's happening from the Great Depression event. The next event on page 2 for the traditionalist was World War II. So the thing was, as you see on your handouts, they sacrificed for the cause. It was kind of a sit down, shut up, do what you're told philosophy. I remember when I was growing up, that it was kind of said as a joke, but it was meant that children are to be seen and not heard, and that's the way I grew up. So for me to see a different generation, and part of that was my rural background, and I was in the Midwest, but for me to see a different generation who's kind of in your face about their attitudes and so forth is a little off-putting, and I have to step back from that and see where my blind spot is about my generational bias when I think through that. So when you think about World War II, it was sacrifice everything for the cause. Prove your loyalty, do your duty, pay your dues, don't question authority, all those kinds of things. They follow the rules, don't they? They're upset by those who don't follow the rules. So that's the traditionalist. And the event was World War II. The next event on page 2 is they moved from the farm to the city. They lived and worked by the sun, not electricity, when they lived on the farm, and they had to work hard because if you don't work, you don't eat. in their attitude. They matured early because they were expected to be out working the farm very early. Everybody pitched in. So what they think of is the staff may not be working as hard when they're interacting with patrons. That doesn't look like work to them. They have a whole different perception of what work should look like, don't they? So when they're walking in your library, that's the kind of thing that they've got in their luggage. That's the kind of thought process that they've got in their luggage, that maybe you're not even working. You've all heard it, and a lot of this comes from the traditionalists, maybe into the baby boomer stage, that all you do is sit around and read all day at the library, right? So that's probably more from the traditionalist standpoint, because they're used to physical manual labor on the farm. And when they went to the city, they went into the factories to support the effort, if you will. So the baby boomers next on the list. The biggest chunk as of the 2011 census for our workforce, and again, that is now starting to switch over to the millennials. But for the baby boomers, at the bottom of page 2, the first event was the boom of babies. Think about how that affected them, because everything became overcrowded. It didn't matter whether it was a job, a school, a hospital, whatever it was, there was competition to get what they wanted and needed. So if you think about how your baby boomers look at your library, they do feel a bit competitive, don't they? About services and is anybody paying attention to me and all those kinds of things. They fought for athletic spots. They kind of got the moniker, if you will, of being a workaholic, because that's what it took to get attention. That's what it took to get recognition. How is anybody going to notice me because I'm just one of many? That's why it's called a baby boom. So what do you think the result of the boom of babies might have been as far as how it affected that generation coming into your library? How does that play out in the diversity of your library, the baby boom, the actual boom, and how do those boomers interact with your library? What are their thoughts when they're coming in? What are their thoughts about different generations? How might that have affected them? Jan said no patience for the traditionalists. Absolutely. Because it's let's just get it done, accomplish what we need to accomplish, be first, all those kinds of things. However, Lisa says they do want to learn more about personal finances and retirement and so forth because they want to be in control, don't they? They've been competitive all their lives. They've kind of controlled their own destinies, if you will. So they want to be able to control that in retirement. Fat chance, right, these days, but they do try. I had down, because of the competitive piece, they are driven to excel, they're problem solvers, which might come into play with the personal finances and the retirement. They don't want to just complain or sit by the side of the road like the traditionalists might. They want to be involved in solving those problems. Heather says some of them are competitive, sometimes to the extent of blame and the idea that I win so you lose. Right, exactly. Or they don't even really, they're not really striving to make you lose, but in their mind, it's always a win-lose situation, right, Heather? So I'm going to be competitive about that and make sure I am the one that wins. And the workaholic piece comes into play because they expect everybody else to work the same way. And let's face it, libraries in general are a different environment, aren't they? Because many people will walk into your library and it might seem like it's not work at all. You know how much work is behind the scenes. You know how hard it is to deal with the public. And yet people walking in think, well, you're surrounded by books and all you're doing is checking out people every day and answering questions. How tough can it be? Yes, absolutely. Top-down mandate for leadership, because that's what it's always been for them. So they don't get this idea of everybody has an equal say at the table that might be more prevalent for them when they come in. Another thing that happened for them at the bottom of page 2 was affluence. They grew up in one of the most optimistic times as far as economics in our history. Now, that's certainly not the case right now, so they're having a hard time adjusting to that, aren't they? I read lots of articles about how they are way overly optimistic about how much they've saved for retirement and way underestimating estimating how much it's going to cost them in retirement because they're so optimistic about economics. They lived a pretty good life, a lot of them. Not all of them, but as far as economically depressed, they probably weren't once the war was over. So you'll see at the bottom of page 2, necessities changed after the war. It changed their value system from the sacrifice to self. In the war effort, it was about sacrificing for the better cause, right? For the good of everybody. They didn't need a lot of kids, so society started thinking that those who were born were more special. The traditionalists had heard at the top of page 3, who do you think you are? But for the baby boomers, it became they were special, and that comes across as arrogance due to their idealism and their confidence. Wow. We don't think about that being in their luggage. So they may think they should be in charge. And Heather says they were told by their employers they would be taken care of in retirement, but it's eroding for them. I have a friend who's several years older than I am, quite a few actually, and she had retired from Delta a few years ago, started getting her pension from Delta, and all of a sudden her pension got cut. It happens to people all the time. And that sense of fairness that they had about, we worked for the cause and we had that job all of our lives and now they're not taking care of us is very disturbing to them. And so there may be, remember we talked about trust being a value that everybody needs in your library? They may have started to have a sense of distrust in today's world, not about the library per se, but about the world and how the world is treating them. And Emily says they're retiring later and later, partly because of that financial thing, right? Partly because I got to tell you, yes, I am a baby boomer. I'm not at the end of the baby, I'm not at the beginning of the baby boomers, but I am classified as a baby boomer. But I tell people all the time, partly because of what I love what I do. I love it. I never want to quit. I never want to get to the point, Diana and I were talking earlier about the snowbirds, where the only thing I have to do is look and see when the Publix ad comes out. For me, retiring later will be financially prudent because I'm single now, but also will be mentally prudent for me. I need to stay involved in the world. So I do believe they're retiring later and later. Where the traditionalists said, I can't wait till retirement, what's the date of my 65th birthday or whatever it might have been, and they retired earlier, and some of them kind of checked out of life at that point. A lot of baby boomers are staying very involved in life, and if they're not staying involved in a paying job, they're getting very involved in volunteer work. Lisa says, I'm a baby boomer and I'll be retiring at the end of this year. Congratulations, Lisa. And I'm going to say what Oprah said. What's your plan? She said when she started talking about quitting her show, Stedman told her, you better have a plan, because she had been so driven all of these years as a baby boomer. He didn't say as a baby boomer, but truly that was part of what she grew up with, and needing to prove herself as a different race, needing to prove herself as a different gender than what was common in that industry at the time. He said, you better have a plan. You better be ready to do something else. And it doesn't matter what that plan is. It just means that don't just check out of life at that point. So the baby boomers may end up thinking they're in charge because they always have been. They got paid a lot of attention by marketers and things over the years because they were such a huge chunk of the population. Lisa says, I have a plan of sorts that I'm thinking about doing. Good for you, Lisa. You'll flesh that out by the end of the year, I'm sure. Another event for the baby boomers was that the generation gap actually started to become noticeable. That at sort of a little bit down on page 3 of your handouts, I've got a lot of information there for you about what happened with the baby boomers. But a lot of it comes down to they went from emphasizing duty and obligation to others to a focus on self. The later you are in the baby boom age, the more we heard about me, me, me. That's what started to come. It was the me generation. It became more about I am number one kind of a thing. And that's not really a positive perspective. It is in some ways, but it became, instead of doing your duty, do your own thing. And so that has an effect on what they bring in. And if you see in the middle of page 3, it talks about there was a first wave of the baby boom and there was a second wave. And it's a considerable difference in their thoughts, isn't it? Even though they're considered the same generation, look at the differences. The first wave, lots of optimism. The war was over, things are good, big chunk of their age group, their peer group. It was the Camelot years of the Kennedys. The space program was developing. We had the Mickey Mouse Club that was so optimistic. We're going to build a better world. But the second wave was when that do your own thing started. We had Watergate, the oil embargo. Instead of inflation or deflation, we had stagflation. Everything was just stagnant. Rowan and Martin's laugh then became very kind of cynical. I saw a rerun of that a few weeks ago. Can't hardly even watch it anymore, but it was a big show back then. But here's the thing we need to realize about the second wave. We went from do your duty to do your own thing, and conspicuous consumption became very prevalent, didn't it? All of a sudden, what would have once been considered a want, W-A-N-T, suddenly becomes a need to the people in the second wave. If you think about it, and this has continued, I believe, people who sometimes have financial issues. If you look, they're driving the latest car. They just went and got the $600 new phone. They're, having their hair done and highlights, and I'm not just talking about females, that's males, and they're spending a lot of money on tattoos and jewelry and all those things because for them that's a need. That's what's in their luggage, folks. That's what they're coming into your library thinking. That what you might have considered a want has now become a need for them. So it's something to think about as we're serving that particular group, the baby boomers. It went from a need to a want now, or from a want to a need, and what they feel is necessary in their lives. Heather said the social upheavals really split the generation into. We continue to see the effects of that fight daily. Absolutely, Heather. It's become very obvious, hasn't it, for the baby boomers. So then we move into the Gen Xers, bottom of page 3, bottom half of page 3. The first event was they were the squished generation. They were 25% smaller group than the boomers or the millennials. That's pretty significant when you're talking about who markets to them, what's available to them, how they're perceived in that marketplace, including the library. Because how often does the library sit down and think about the Gen Xers as far as services and programming? You might, and that's great. And I certainly don't want to put people in such a box that that's all we think about. But we often think about serving what we call the elderly portion of our patrons and serving the younger portion of our patrons. And yet those Gen Xers are squeezed in between that, aren't they? So they were squished. Marketers weren't paying attention. They felt like they were kind of left behind. The boomers were getting all the promotions, and they had to wait till somebody died or retired to move into that slot. Pretty depressing place to be. They tend to be perceived as a bit whiny, because why bother? By the time they actually got to the point where they could advance, the millennials were up and coming, and they were getting all of the attention. So they were still being squished. That kind of results, if you think about the TV shows that started to come alive when they were growing up, The Simpsons, The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, all those kinds of things kind of lowered expectations about what life has to offer, kind of negative perceptions about life in general, family life, community life, whatever, tongue-in-cheek comedy, but that's usually rooted in something real, isn't it? And so they kind of became skeptical and cynical. Any other thoughts about what happened to Gen X as they were perceived as the squished generation before we move on to another event that influenced them? I see multiple attendees typing. Latchkey kids, absolutely, Christine. And some positives from that, as far as, being able to handle things and those kinds of things, but some real negatives from that. Both parents working. sort of left behind in that perspective too, right? Lisa says they only think of themselves and not others as much. It's that skepticism, cynical thing, isn't it, Lisa? That's what's in their luggage. I hope you understand that a little bit more now. They actually do have some legitimate beef, don't they, to feel that way. So think about that nobody really paid attention to. It's kind of like being the middle child, isn't it? I'm a youngest child. I don't fall into the birth pattern that people talk about. People have asked me to do programs on birth order, and I said I can't because I so far am way out in left field when it comes to how I fall in the birth order and how I'm supposed to be acting through life, that I can't really teach anything on that because I don't qualify. So absolutely, we talk about recessions, the beginning of outsourcing. The entry of the internet came partway through their lives. You start to see that they're kind of left out of things. A new resource of demand that wasn't being covered in education but was suddenly absolutely vital. Think about outsourcing. Thank you, Heather, for pointing that out. I don't even know if I mentioned that in this group of stuff that we're talking about, but certainly here we are squished again. Nobody wants us. Not only now do we have to wait on the baby boomers to retire and watch out for the millennials who might be running over us, now we have to watch out for people outsourced that might be running over us. I can kind of get why they might have felt that way. So the next thing at the bottom of the page talks about what I have here first is they're not trusting. As I said, skeptical, cynical. I kind of get that, why that would be in their luggage. The next thing we have at the bottom of the page is divorce becomes very prevalent. Along with those two income households became the knowledge from the, and I'm going to use the word female because that's what it was back then, the female perspective was, I can do this on my own if I need to, and I'm not going to put up with something I'm not happy with. And so that became prevalent. So now the diversity of lifestyles, different rules at mom's house versus dad's house. I may have mentioned this in a previous program, but years and years ago I went through a marriage mentoring program to mentor younger couples, not necessarily younger, but people getting married in our church. So we went through a bunch of training to help do that. And one of the things that struck me most in that many hours of training was they drew a diagram for us of what it looked like to be in a household where mom and dad had both been married before. It was so complex. I couldn't believe it because now we have mom and dad, but dad was married before and his first wife has kids from her new marriage and mom's first husband, you can get that. It was so complicated and I thought, oh my gosh, I never looked at it from that perspective. So you can imagine when divorce became more prevalent that they felt very disoriented. They felt like everything else came first. And sometimes it did out of necessity, but sometimes kind of out of a selfishness that we all experience as human beings. So they value control over their time more than anything else. And there's a possibility that when you schedule things for this group, if you do, that they're not so much interested because they want to control their own time. And they really don't have that trust level to believe that what you are doing is to their benefit. That cynicism comes in. They're educated a lot of times, and they're not intimidated by authority, and they don't trust, and you know what else? They don't have a lot of respect for what, quote, might be authority figures in life. Heather says the fundamental relationships are unstable. Family, love, job security, all non-existent. Government, unstable as well. Loss of trust, Iran-Contra, all of that. I've become a Gen Xer, I think, because I have some of that cynicism with what goes on in our world today. So understanding when they come into your library, or maybe you work with one or you're on a committee with one, you can start to understand why they feel the way they feel about how life has existed. Now we move on to the next event, and this is kind of sad but true. Remember, we talked a lot, and we didn't talk about it in today's workshop, but if you remember back far enough to talk about baby boomers, you remember we talked about upward mobility. We talked about dinks, double income, no kids, that kind of thing they were called back then. The preppies, I guess we called them back then, but it was very much about moving up the ladder and controlling our destiny and all those kinds of things. But for the Gen Xers, whoops, and I moved too far. For the Gen Xers, the event became downward mobility. Lifetime employability, like somebody mentioned, Reagan calling AIDS grid for a while. Oh, I didn't even realize that, Heather. Heather said, I'd say that Desert Storm probably also plays into what you're describing. Yes, yes. Lots of things. And you know what? Underlying that is there were probably a lot of things that could have played into different attitudes and different thought processes as baby boomers were growing up, but we didn't know about them because we had newspapers, and sometimes the newspaper was delivered a day or two after something had happened. And by the time we actually read about it, it was kind of, look what happened 2 days ago. But now it's instantaneous, isn't it? So some of these things that are happening for us are so in our face that it becomes a lot more evident. But that downward mobility piece at the top of page 4, the job security's gone for them, right? It's gone for all of us now too, but we grew up, some of us grew up with it if we're on the baby boomer edge, but the Gen Xers really didn't. They missed that economy growth that some of us got to enjoy. But they did arrive in time for growth in prices, being squished for jobs and housing. They have college expenses quadrupling, economic optimism to economic pessimism, and the thought that my boss has a career, but I have a job. That really took hold with the Gen Xers. So in essence, in their luggage, there might be some anger there because they feel like they've been skipped over completely. They have to work a lot harder at being engaged in society, don't they? Not only because society has kind of overlooked them, but because can they generate enough interest to try to re-engage with society? Because they have that anger and that skepticism and that cynicism and not a lot of trust. I don't mean to make you depressed, but I want you to understand, if you're from that generation, now you can understand maybe some of your own blind spots or hidden areas about your preconceived notions, but also those people that you're interacting with. That's what we need to understand. And for the Gen Xers, there's not a lot of positivity. I wish I could say there is, but from everything I've read, you have to work a little harder. But guess what? In all of this, everything we've talked about, there's a choice. There's a choice for me as a baby boomer. Am I going to get stuck in that? Am I going to have certain expectations, or am I going to open up my mind to that? And that's the case for every generation, isn't it? Because we all have negative stereotypes that have been built about our generation. Are we going to buy into that, as I see a lot of people do in every generation? Or am I going to say, you know what, that's what the calendar says about me, that's what society says about me, but I have my own choices in how I live life? Lisa says this generation wants their materials, books, information, resources immediately. So I don't want anybody to become depressed today, but I do want you to be realistic, because if you're not going to be able to understand the different generations coming in, and it will be more difficult to interact with them and to see their perspective. That's what I want you to do today, is to see their perspective. So let's think about the millennials next. And I apologize again because the S went into to the second line. We have no idea why. It just does. So the first thing is heavy parental involvement, toward the top of page 4 of your handouts. And when I'm talking heavy parental involvement, I have talked to people who have called the Navy to get their son off of a ship because he wasn't happy there, and this is real life. I talked to this person who made the call. They're called helicopter parents. I have talked to people who have interviewed millennials whose parents wait in the reception area of the job interview or even try to come into the interview. I've talked to people whose parents have called after the interview to see why their child wasn't hired. Okay, so there's heavy parental involvement. The effect is that they feel very wanted. It was the era of missing children, so parents became their activity directors rather than just their parents. They didn't want to let them outside because people were stealing kids. So you can see why they became more involved. Maybe didn't understand the point at which they shouldn't be as much involved. But on the other side of that, millennials often still want their parents involved. Remember, I told you that that age of being an adult, it's called prolonged adolescence, now is 26, 27, 28, instead of maybe 18 to 22 when they get their first degree. Years ago, they were kind of thought of as their adolescence was over, but now that's not necessarily the case. So that became the parental involvement piece that other previous generations just don't get, but it's real for the millennials. We hear from society that the millennials are entitled. If you look at the next event on your list, it says fear of low self-esteem. Parents and teachers got really involved in making sure everybody felt good about themselves. This is the era of everybody gets a trophy. But you know what? When they get on the job, that's not necessarily so. So there's that struggle for them of, I was always told I was special and that I deserved an award too. But when you get on a job, sometimes that's not the case, right? Another effect of that is they feel very confident speaking their mind. Even the new kid on the job feels very confident speaking their mind, and other generations don't know quite what to do with that. So they are not aware that maybe their lack of experience might lead to some bad decisions or to some opinions that really don't have experience backing them up, and why other generations might not buy into their opinions because that experience isn't there. So that's the effect of that fear of low self-esteem, is that they're wanting to make sure that they get a lot of feedback and so forth. So another thing, didn't we also see massive marketing? Yes, to children and teens. Absolutely, Heather, great point. Take off in the 80s and 90s, and there wasn't much before that for kids or even teens to be considered a category. And if you think that it took off in the 80s and 90s, look at what it's done in the last decade. It's almost all geared toward that, isn't it? Whether it's food, clothing, even cars, all those kinds of things. You know, you watch the, State Farm commercial where the teenager got a brand new, I think it might be a VW or Fiat or something, and the older guy got his car stolen. It's the cult of the youth, the culture of the youth, we'll call that. But yeah, it's become very prevalent, which feeds into their need for recognition, but guess what it does to the other generations? It just pushes them farther and farther away. So there's that balance, isn't there? When we talk about your library, remember we talked about balance. We've got to balance the culture of youth with the culture that we still have a lot of vital, quote, older people who are not millennials that also need our services as well. Lisa says through the generations there's been a change in commercials on TV and radio. Yeah, big time. I don't even like to watch a lot of the commercials because a lot of the commercials have become very, I'm going to call them crude, to pull in younger people. Not that younger people are crude as a group, but for some reason our marketers seem to feel that that's the only way to get their attention, with curse words and sexual innuendos and all those kinds of things. So it's become very, from my perspective, crude because I'm a baby boomer. So understanding that in your library will help you decide how to market to those different generations sometimes too. So entitled is one of the things that they came across with. The next event on the page talks about the consumer age. McDonald's, remember, had a toy with every meal. I don't know if they still do that with kids' meals, but back then it was very oriented to who's going to give me something to buy their product. They were raised as consumers. They have more choices. They ask for what they want. They look elsewhere if you can't give it to them, and that might be part of what leads to that entitlement mentality. And that comes into play whether it's concerning your services or your job, because if you can't give them what they want, they'll go somewhere else. They tend to be a bit restless that way, or perceived as restless, don't they? So they tend to also be perceived as a distaste for what they consider menial work. because of their want for high self-esteem. And what they consider menial and what we consider menial might be two different things if we're not of the millennial generation, and I certainly don't want to speak to that for the millennial generation because we probably have some in the room today. But if we understand the other generation's perspective, and I can only speak from personal experience from one generation. I can't live in other generations, but I can certainly understand where different generations are coming from. If I look at that, it definitely makes it easier for me. Another thing happened for them was September 11th of 2001. 9/11 is what we call it. We've also had two economic crashes in the meantime, in 2000 and 2008, and plus the turmoil after 9/11. It was kind of an innocence lost stage, wasn't it? Where, again, that cynicism may come into play. There is no innocence anymore. Tomorrow may never arrive. They see things on TV with SWAT teams in public places. It's just a whole different environment for them. They don't see a lot of reason to sacrifice everything today for a future because it may not come. That reward that they would like to have may never come, so why not expect it now? So in essence, one of the results of that also became that they're not as focused on work, are they? And I love that they're not as focused on work. I think that it can go to the extreme, just like a lot of things can go to the extreme for other generations. They don't maybe grasp as quickly how to live life on their own, so it makes it more difficult to repay bills, and maybe credit cards get a little bit overexposed and those kinds of things. They probably don't stay as long as at a job. Years ago, when an interviewer was looking at a resume, the first thing they looked at was how long has somebody been in a job. They still look at that, and now maybe being on the job 20 years might be a detriment instead of a plus like it was years ago. And when I say years ago, I'm not talking 50 years ago. I'm talking maybe 10 or 12 years ago that it was a plus to stay on a job. And now, although they don't want to see you at a job for 6 months and you've had 18 jobs in the last 9 years, they want to see some movement and some progression sometimes to see that you are building up your experience and your depth of knowledge or your breadth of knowledge. They also maybe look at a job for more of a match of values and beliefs, and money might not be as much of a motivator. So when you're thinking about millennials, especially in your workplace, because a lot of times that's where these differences really show up, that might be something to think about. So the next event for millennials is at the top of page 5, technology is everywhere. Not so much for the baby boomers, pretty much for the Gen Xers, but it maybe is more of a tool for them and more of an escape for them. But for millennials, they want it everywhere. As an introvert, this comes more from my introvert side than it does my baby boomer side. I don't like the invasion of technology into my space. In the mornings when I have my quiet time, if my cell phone rings, I'm really irritable about that. Just because I'm an introvert and I need my quiet time. So sometimes we need to understand that this has more to do with the person than their generation. But certainly technology, top of page 5, is everywhere. The first generation of digital natives, 53 plus hours per week with media. And they often use more than one kind at the same time. Technology makes them more important to the older generation because we need them. We need them to show us how to use things, how to develop better applications for things, all those kinds of things. It gave them the freedom, it should say gave them freedom, not freed, to play indoors because they can engage in games indoors instead of going outside. Those of us who didn't grow up with that don't really understand not wanting to be outside in the fresh air, not wanting to go enjoy the sunshine or whatever. It shrank and expanded their world at the same time, and I love that thought process because they expanded their world because they're in touch with the whole world now. But it also tends to keep them in their own little corner. So the result of that event of having technology everywhere is that maybe there's a lack of social skills. We've detected some of that they will text somebody at the next table instead of talk to them, but also that they're connected 24/7 even with their employers. And I got to tell you, I could not buy into that if I was going and getting, quote, a regular job today. Because of who I am, I don't want to be connected 24/7. I will give you 182% when I'm there, but I don't want you calling me at 9 o'clock at night to ask me a question, because that's invading my space. So do you see that difference? The millennials may not be that involved with that. They really don't care that if you call them at 9 o'clock at night, but I need that disconnect. And I will tell you that studies are starting to show that most people need the disconnect, no matter what their age group or what generation they're in. Psychologically speaking, for mental health, it's good to have the disconnect from work. And there are more and more recommendations now that no matter what your environment is, that you disconnect from work at a certain point. The other thing we've already mentioned for millennials is that emerging adulthood. They're considered an adult now at around 26, 27 years old, sometimes even up to 28. So sometimes that's perceived that they're lazy if they're younger than that. They aren't sure that they found what they want to do. They don't even know if they found the organization they want to do it with. They don't know where they want to live, with whom, what they want to do. It's kind of a what's in it for me philosophy, because they look more at life. And I see I've missed a few comments here, so I want to... Heather says, so many jobs are part-time, lower wages, so employers are telling them to pay your dues. Absolutely, that is coming out of that. My scroll bar is acting kind of funny here, so I apologize if I miss a comment. Only part-time for no money. Lisa, maybe we should capitalize on this generation, ask them to assist us in teaching others how to use technology. Absolutely. Yes, that's a very good idea, because draw them into that. Help them understand why those people don't understand, because they tend to think it's just because they're, quote, old. It's because they didn't have that experience right from the beginning. So try, if you're going to have them, pull them into assisting and teaching others, help them understand where those others are coming from to begin with. So here's the last thing I wanted to read from you that I just came across this morning. There was a comment on theatlantic.com, and it was talking about millennials. And this person is a millennial. She's 28 years old. She says, becoming an adult is more of an elusive sort of abstract concept than I'd thought when I was younger. I just assumed you'd get to a certain age and everything would make sense. Bless my young little heart, I had no idea. Remember, she's 28. At 28, I can say that sometimes I feel like an adult, and a lot of the time I don't. Being a millennial and trying to adult is wildly disorienting. I can't figure out if I'm supposed to start a nonprofit, get another degree, develop a wildly profitable entrepreneurial venture, or somehow travel the world and make it look effortless online. When I read that, I went, wow, that's true. They are being thrown all these ideas for how big the world is, but it's hard to decide which one to take. That's Linda Bruno's comment. She says, mostly it just looks like taking a job that won't ever pay off my student debt in a field that is not the one that I studied. Then if I hold myself to the traditional idea